I'm going to quickly introduce Tim and John, and then I'll turn it over to them. So Tim Johnson came to Smith in 2017 as the 6th director of the Botanic Garden of Smith College. Prior to arriving, he was the head of preservation and seed bank manager at the international nonprofit Seed Savers Exchange. At Smith, Tim has worked with staff to develop a new collections policy, completed a 16-month strategic planning process with widespread community engagement, began a critical examination of how accessible students of color perceive Smith's Gardens and Conservatory, and initiated a revision of the Botanic Garden's mission to put some social justice at the center of the garden's work. Tim serves on the college's Committee on Campus Sustainability and the Campus Planning Committee. He co-led the college's landscape master plan process and serves on the steering committee for the landscape studies minor, the book studies concentration, and the environmental concentration. Tim is also an active member of the American Public Gardens Association. Tim earned his BS in biology from the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire and has MS and doctoral degrees in environmental horticulture from the University of Florida. So John Berryhill is the Botanic Garden's landscape curator and has been at Smith for just over 25 years. In that time, he's served several roles, including wildflower gardener and chief arborist. John is tasked with ensuring that the building and management of the outdoor collections at Smith is rooted in and reflective of the Botanic Garden's collection policy, strategic plan, and mission statement. As curator, his current work is oriented toward building a strong conservation component to the collections and operations at Smith and establishing partnerships that will amplify the value of that work. This shift is articulated in the crafting of the Botanic Garden's new collections management plan, an effort that he led in the last 2 years. John also manages the outdoor horticulture staff and is a primary partner for student interns, workers, and learners in the Smith Garden spaces. John is also a current graduate student at Smith, researching the challenges that rare plants face in changing climate and the role that botanic gardens can play in protecting them. And with that, I'm delighted to turn it over to John and Tim.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning. Very excited to be here co-presenting with John. Maybe some of you caught John's amazing keynote at the Bulb Show just a couple of weeks ago. We assume that there's kind of 3 broad categories of people joining us today. Some of you might be fairly new to gardening. You're just sort of figuring things out, or you're trying to develop your green thumb. Some of you might already be skilled gardeners, and you might be here hoping to, learn the way that gardeners often learn from each other, or to gain some more confidence that you're on the right track. And some of you might be here just because you're really interested in Smith and want to know what's going on. So John and I will be giving a little bit for everybody. And we're going to be dividing this presentation up into 2 big chunks. I'll be talking a little bit about waking up your spring garden at the home scale. And then John's going to be talking a little bit more about Smith College campus and some of the things that our outdoor team is up to right now. So I'm going to talk about seed starting, a little bit about layout of gardens, especially vegetable gardens. I'm a huge vegetable gardener. I'm just getting into the landscape gardening, but that's really my roots, pun intended, are in vegetable gardening. And talk a little bit about tidying up, what we could do to make sure to set our garden up for success in the spring. And then we had a lot of questions about soil fertility, which is really exciting because usually that's kind of a more advanced topic and it's one of the last things we think about, but as we develop our gardening skills, we come to see that as the first thing. So let's talk a little bit about seed starting. I really love seed starting, growing my own starts from seed, and there's a couple of reasons for this. One is it's much more cost effective once you're actually set up. So I can buy a packet of seeds for $3.50, $4, about the price of 1 tomato transplant, and that packet of seeds might last me 2 or 3 years. So it's less expensive. The other reason is that once I can grow my own vegetables or landscape plants from seed, it really opens the door to what I'm growing beyond what I can find at my local garden center. That's really exciting. The third reason is that I really love that as a person who starts my garden from seed, many of my plants from seed, my gardening season is well on its way. I started gardening, actually growing stuff about 4 or 5 weeks ago when I started growing some artichoke seeds. So those are kind of that's my pitch for seed starting. And there's not a lot of specialized equipment that you need, but there are a couple of things that can really help to set you up for success. The first is a heat mat. I would highly recommend using a heat mat for seed starting. It puts the heat right where you need it, which is in the soil itself. Really helps to make sure that seed emergence is very uniform. And then if you're growing, for example, in a basement, like many of us are, growing in a cooler, humid basement, a heat mat really can help to overcome some of the diseases like damping off that can really ruin your seed starting season. The second thing is a couple of grow lights. I actually use 2 different types of lights. So what you're seeing in these images are fluorescent lights. These are fluorescent lights that have the right spectrum for plants. And then once my plants are up, once my seeds are up, I actually move them under another light, which is an LED, which is much more powerful. And I sort of use that to drive growth. It helps to keep plants that want to stretch, keeps them much shorter, so my tomatoes don't get too big. And then it also makes the transition outside a little bit easier because the plants are used to a higher intensity light. If you're starting from seed, you're going to want to get a specialized seed starting mix. This is a smaller particle size, lower nutrient level. It really helps the seedlings to get established without burning them. And then a couple of different plug trays. I start in primarily two different types of trays. So you can see this photo of some spinach seedlings popping up. Those I planted directly into these little plug trays. And then some of my other plants like solanums, peppers, and tomatoes, I start in troughs. I use long single trough trays because once they germinate, I'll actually transfer them into larger plug trays. So one of the tricks with seed starting is to really know when to start seeds, and that can be a little bit intimidating, but it's actually pretty easy. All you have to do is you figure out what your last frost date is. There's a number of online resources for checking based on your zip code, and then you follow the garden advice about when to start things. And I would just caution to follow that advice. Sometimes we get excited, we want to start things earlier. Well, then we're managing larger and larger plants, and that can be kind of a challenge, especially for newer gardeners. So follow that advice on when to get things started. Let's talk a little bit about layout, especially about a vegetable garden. This can be really important. In particular, I want to talk about crop rotation. You generally don't want to be putting the same crops into the same soil year after year. So if you put your carrots in a bed, you don't want to put carrots in there that next year. In fact, if you can, you want to wait 3 years before you put carrots back into that bed. And the reason for this is that some of the bacteria, the fungi, the pests and diseases that vegetables will naturally pick up, they can actually become habituated in your soil, and they can make it harder and harder to grow that crop. So you want to have a couple of different places to move your plants around. The other thing, I should point out this too. There's a number of tools for actually navigating, laying out your garden. There are apps and websites and garden planning books. And this is actually my board. I'm very analog. I just have a giant piece of cardboard, and I draw all my beds on that to scale, and then I start to use little Post-it notes to kind of figure out where my garden is, and I can track this year after year, which makes it easier to make sure that I'm rotating my crops. The other thing to think about is complementary planting. So we can actually get some added benefit if we put good neighbors together in the vegetable garden. So tomatoes and beans grow really well together. Beans are nitrogen fixers, and tomatoes are heavy nitrogen feeders, and so they complement each other. Tomatoes and basil work really well together. The basil might help to repel some common some common pests on tomatoes. It also might increase pollination. There's some evidence that it increases fruit set. And then there's also some anecdotal evidence, at least, that when grown together, these actually increase overall yield of tomato, which suggests there might be some symbiosis happening below the soil line. If we're mindful about our layout, we can also avoid problematic combinations. So tomatoes and corn, not a great combination. They're both heavy feeders, and they actually share some insect pests. The third thing to consider is just laying out your garden for ease of maintenance, and also so that it's aesthetically pleasing. So you might put things that require more water close together, or things you're going to be fertilizing more often close together. I also, because my garden is right off my back deck and it's a little crowded, I like to put the taller plants a little bit further away, just to give the illusion that my garden is actually larger than it is. Spring's also the right time to do your tidying up. We have seen a real gradual transition in sort of thinking about cutting down standing plant matter as soon as it's done in the fall, to leaving it up into the fall. And now we're talking about leaving it into an extended spring. Newer research suggests actually leaving it until you've had at least a week of 50-degree weather. And the reason for that is that if there's insects that are in the stems or that are in the debris, this gives them a chance to emerge. So for biodynamic gardeners, you might think about even designing your garden so that you can leave that matter standing longer and longer, and you get the chance to sort of do some of this amazing design work, like in these couple of images where we can see that even as a frost, these gardens are working really hard even when they're not growing. Spring's also the right time to be getting your mulching done. So what I like to do is work locally. I try to avoid plastic bags and carbon footprint as much as possible. And so that means that in our area, the most renewable source of mulch is actually a number of our arboriculture companies in town. And so I can get an entire pickup truck load of chips dropped off in my yard. I like to use mulch that is not that's not dyed, just because I don't know what's in there. Also, dyed mulch tends to not look pretty for that long, so you're going to have to try to sort of deal with that loss of color anyway. The other thing is, John likes to always remind me of this, that if you're going to spend time in your garden, one of the most impactful things you can do is just edging your garden beds. Even if you don't have something reinforced or stone or cortan, steel, some of these nice fancy edging materials, just cutting in a nice clean line does a lot for a bed, and will actually help to hide any weeds that you just didn't get to. Weeds are part of gardening, but having a perfectly weeded bed doesn't have as much impact as having a nice clean edge. All right, let's talk a little bit about nurturing the soil. Lots of questions about this, lots of pre-questions about this, again, very exciting, including how to find high quality compost. For this, the best advice I have is to talk to other gardeners. Where do your neighbors get their compost? What are they using? Word of mouth is the best advertising when it comes to compost. You, in general, want your compost to be not too wet. It should be kind of friable, kind of crumbly. You shouldn't see a lot of visible plant material in it, or sticks or rocks. You don't want to see a lot of plastic in it. I will say, maybe a mark of how much more of our food is hitting compost is that we get a lot of those darn little fruit stickers. So, but I don't want to see a lot of those. That tells me there might be some quality control issues. Another option is to make your own. This is a little bit of a more advanced note, but I got into vermicomposting a couple of years ago. And now all winter long, I've been producing this really high quality worm casting fertilizer using all of our home scraps and converting those into high quality nutrients for the garden. A little bit of a reading up is required to really set these up for success, but if you're interested, I would highly recommend trying it out. I also complement my worm composting with another type of composting, which is called bokashi composting, which uses a airtight container and a anaerobic bacteria to break down and pre-compost some of my plant material. And food waste, including some people will actually use bokashi with meats and dairy, which is an advantage. You can't do that with worms. So between these two things, we've actually cut our household garbage in about half because we generate a lot of food scraps, it turns out. Before I talk about hugelkultur, we also had questions about soil testing. And here's my advice about soil testing. There's kind of two instances when I think about it. The one is when I think I've isolated all other potential problems and I'm still having trouble. So let's say that I've got good quality soil and I've got good quality plants and I feel like I'm watering sufficiently and I have enough light and something's going wrong. At that point, I might look to get a soil test done. The other instance is, in particular, if I'm putting in a garden in brand new soil, particularly if I'm putting it someplace where there was turf. And the reason for that is because the requirements for turf, their nutrient demands are very, very different. And also just the composition of the soil there can be very different. And so a soil test can really help you get going early into new ground. Those are the two instances when I would use it. This is a technique, this hugelkultur, the next thing I'm going to talk about is a technique I'm really excited about. This year, I am putting in a new bed. I like to use cedar. I use 2x6s, so I get a 12-inch raised bed. And I generally just fill that with compost. I have very sandy soil, so I still get good drainage. But this year I'm going to try a technique called hugelkultur, which is a German word for mound culture. And the idea here is to create an environment where you have a very slow composting happening deep in the garden bed itself. So putting in larger sticks in the bottom and then smaller twigs on top of that and covering that up with fresh leaves and then leaf mold and then compost. And over time, this is going to create a really an environment that's really inviting for fungi and bacteria. And I should have a really nice nitrogen and carbon cycle happening in that space.
Hey, thank you, Tim. And hello, everybody. Happy spring to all of you. I've had so many great conversations with alums around commencement time, and it's so nice to get to connect at the start of the season as we're all sort of anticipating all the good that the season ahead of us is going to bring. I want to share a couple of the highlights that I like to draw people's attention to in the gardens this time of year, as well as some of the work that our team is busy with. And then I'm going to pivot to a couple of horticulture questions as well, specifically the two that I get asked the most often on campus here, and perhaps some version of those questions will be on your minds too. And I couldn't get started without these two plants, these dear friends of mine, the Palette of Witch Hazel in our Ruth Brown Richardson perennial border near Lyman, and the Adonis plant that's one of the sort of the morning star of our rock garden, if you will. These two bold plants always open up on those first couple warm days in March, and I think of them as sort of the bugle call that announce what is ahead and what is on the horizon, which is, if my slide will advance, there we go, which is this, the Wilson Bulb Bank. Sort of, I think of this as the second round of our bulb show. And Wilson Bulb Bank is just north of Wright Hall. And for about 50 weeks of the year, it's maybe easy to ignore, even if it is a pretty place, but it's the prettiest place on campus, if not the whole Pioneer Valley, for about 2 weeks, starting right about now. This picture's last year, but we're on the verge of this right now. And it's just a wonderful reminder of the season extending power of perennial bulbs in this climate. And we have plenty of spots on campus that we have daffodils and crocus and Chionodoxa, that lovely blue of the Scilla I'm so fond of. But they really liven up these quiet places. They're so low maintenance, and it's really worth a tour around campus to try to find them during this ephemeral, colorful moment. And speaking of ephemeral, right on the heels of that wave of color, our main gardens start to wake up and shine. And I always try to draw people's attention to the rock garden. And it doesn't surprise anybody that the rock garden is a nice place to be. But one thing that many people don't know, and it certainly took me many years to learn this and really experience this, is that the nature, the ecology rather, of alpine plants is such that this garden is much more, turns over much faster. It's a more mercurial garden. And the kaleidoscope that every garden is turns a lot faster. And if you have only seen this once in the spring, you've missed several incarnations, several lives that this garden has in April and in May, each with its own distinct spirit and its own palette of colors. They're really beautiful and should be seen at least every 2 weeks or so. And our horticulture team is extremely busy with a lot of the fun work that Tim was just describing. A lot of that occurs in Capon Greenhouse, a facility that some don't even know exists because it's tucked in this tiny little corner west of Capon Garden, but we use it quite a bit in the spring and in the winter. We start our seeds there of the summer annuals that go out into our gardens once the threat of frost is gone. And we also use one of these houses that we keep cold but not freezing to overwinter some of the non-hardy perennials and woody plants that spend the growing season in our garden, like the dahlias and canna lilies, and then the big, beautiful rosemary plants and bay laurels and that Buddha's hand citron you see in the bottom left there. All those go out to places like the Happy Chase Garden that you see with maybe our third round of the bulb show, the tulips in Happy Chase and Capon. The reason we can do all of that is because of all the work that happens in the propagation greenhouse. And this season in particular, one thing I'm particularly looking forward to is a project that we did with the Smith College Museum of Art, and more specifically with Amanda Williams, who was an artist in residence there for a couple of years that wound down this past fall. And as her last big project, we teamed up with her to, well, the piece is designed to encourage observers to contemplate and consider the forgotten and desired paths in our lives, both the physical ones under our feet and the figurative ones in our minds. And the project will emerge as in the form of thousands of tulips that will create paths that transect several prominent lawns on campus. And it should be really spectacular. And it's exciting to be able to make this kind of collaborators as keepers of one of, stewards, I should say, of one of Smith's teaching collections. It's nice to be able to team up and co-create something with another. Of course, spring is tree planting season. This is something we think about year round, but most of it is done this time of year. A lot of thought goes into this as we look to develop both the aesthetic and the scientific dimensions of our collections and our arboretum here. And I want to give you examples of what that thinking looks like in action. These plantings were last year. If you look on the left, that's John M. Green Hall, and it's one of 2 London plane trees that went in. They are perfectly matched in front and someday will become giants, and their chalky white bark and stems will perfectly frame that beautiful front facade of John M. Green Hall and complement the nice stark brick beautifully year round. And then on the right side there, we're behind Northrop and Gillette House. And that big traffic island that's bisected by a walkway is used to be home to 2 beautiful linden trees that filled the space nicely, but we lost them a while back. And we're really excited about this grove of river birch that's going in to replace them. They're a super tough tree, a very fast growing tree. They have nice year-round interest, and they will fill the space and create this sort of microforest, if you will, that will be seen and felt by students who look out their window and walk under it on their way to class, rather than the sort of harsh open space that's there now. These 2 plantings are really aimed at honoring and sustaining the Olmstedian spirit of the landscape here that's been celebrated since 1895. And if those 2 plantings are aimed at honoring the last 120, or I should say at sustaining what we've been doing for the last 125 years of history, what you see here is very much aimed at the next 125 years. These are 15 seedlings of Ashes magnolia that arrived just last week from the USDA. Ashes magnolia is the smallest, or has the smallest range rather, of any native magnolia, and we acquired them as part of our involvement in a brand new conservation, or I should say international conservation program called the Global Conservation Consortium for Magnolia. And magnolia seeds cannot be seed banked for conservation. They cannot tolerate the freezing and drying process that's involved in that. They have to be held in living conservation collections. those collections must contain scores, if not hundreds, of individual trees that collectively represent the genetic diversity that the entire species has. It's critical work. It takes more than one institute. It's more work than one institution can do. So this effort aims to synergize the strengths of places like Smith that can collectively provide this firewall against extinction of threatened species in the wild. These networked collections, or I should say collections of collections, are being called meta collections. And the work here our students will be front and center in it, and it'll once again put the work of our gardens at really the cutting edge of what botanic gardens can and should be doing in the century ahead. I'll pivot now to those horticulture questions. The first one that I get so often is when is a good time to plant a particular tree or shrub, a maple or a holly or so on? And my answer to this question is always any time is a great time to plant it. As long as the ground is thawed and you can get a shovel into it, go ahead and put your plant into the ground. But I'm of course talking about if a plant is already out of the ground, it's always going to be happier in the ground. However, if the question actually means, is now an okay time to transplant something, the answer is different. You can see from the drawing on the right there that the roots of trees and shrubs spread horizontally much more than we realize they do, more so than is depicted in that drawing. But in order to get a manageable sized plant, we have to cut a lot of those roots. And therefore, transplanting is best done when a plant, a tree or shrub is dormant. And that means before the buds break in the spring and after the leaves drop, or after the leaves drop in the fall. That allows them to regrow some of those fine water absorbing roots before the water need resumes in the growing season. Now, if you're interested in the welfare of your newly planted plant and who's not, I do want to share one thought that I think is really underappreciated in the nursery industry, in the landscaping industry, and among home gardeners, and that is the quality of root systems of nursery trees and shrubs. Typically, when we get something from a nursery, it's either container grown, as you see in the center, or it's balled and burlapped, as you see on the left there. They both have their advantages and disadvantages, and I just want to touch on them briefly for you. Balled and burlapped trees, as this, I apologize, it's a somewhat blurry picture, was the advantage of them is that their root structure of them is often very good because they were growing in the field, in the ground. When I say good root structure, I mean that the roots are radiating from the central stem primarily. I'll talk about why that's important in just a second. That's the advantage. The disadvantage is you often get, because they are transplanted out of the ground, you get that trauma that I just described a moment ago. And often the size of the root system relative to the stem system is really unfavorable. The minimum recommendation that they say is that you should have 1 foot of root ball diameter to every inch of stem diameter. And you measure the stem diameter about 1 foot above the root ball. If I had to guess at this tree, this is just a picture I found on the internet, I'm going to guess that's about a 3.5 inch diameter stem and maybe a 2 foot diameter root ball, which means the roots are just about a little more than half the minimum, not the ideal, but the minimum of what they ought to be. It will have trouble surviving, I believe. And if we have container grown plants, of course, we have all the roots because the plants have been growing in the pot their whole life usually. So if we plant it in the ground, we see what across the top there, the stems grow, the roots grow, and those circling roots become what are called girdling roots as the main stem swells and is constricted by them. That constriction interferes with the flow of water and nutrients up and down the stem. It harms the plant and it can kill the plant. This can happen decades after planting, and it's such a shame to see a tree kind of come into its glory as a mature tree and then succumb to something that was very preventable at the time of planting. If you want to prevent this harm, you have to prune out the girdling roots at the time of planting. And sadly, that sort of sacrifices the advantage you get with container grown trees. I want to point out too that planting at the right depth is very critical too. It's common for things to be planted too low, which is worse than a little too high. Planting too low also promotes girdling roots. You want your tree to look like a clarinet dig out the roots, the soil till you find that root flare and place it like a clarinet on the ground. Now, fortunately, I do have a tip that I think minimizes the downside of both of these types of nursery trees and shrubs, and that is a simple one. Buy small plants. I can't say it enough. There's so many advantages. For a tree, you might pay hundreds of dollars or less for a small tree than you will for a larger tree. It'll be more resilient. It'll have a better chance of surviving. It will grow faster. It will catch up in a couple of years to the larger tree that you paid $300 more to buy. Those are all great reasons to do it. And the root to shoot ratio is always better on smaller plants. That's why it's better for bald and burlap. And for the container grown, they haven't been there as in the pot as long. You don't have to prune as much. So can't say it enough. Buy small trees. The second question I get is around timing of pruning. Is now an okay time to prune a particular tree or shrub? And I always understand this question when it's asked it usually seems to be implying, am I going to harm the tree or shrub that I'm pruning by pruning it now, whenever now is? And the answer to that is almost always no, you will not harm the plant. It does not care. However, there's a big asterisk that comes with this. You might not get the short-term results that you're aiming for if you don't consider timing. There's lots of directions we can go in this, but I do want to say you should always start with the question, not when should I prune, but why am I pruning? We prune for lots of reasons. Removing dead, damaged, diseased stems is one reason. Those should come out automatically right away, anytime. Prune those out anytime. But the other reasons to prune, I think homeowners, the most common reason to prune a tree or a shrub is size control or shaping. And a lot of the plants we bring into our home gardens and landscapes, we bring in for their flowers, such as this beautiful forsythia that we see on the right there. Now, it might surprise you if I told you that both the plants in this slide are equally happy and equally healthy. So what on earth is going on here? Well, if you had the plant on the right in your home landscape and you felt that it was needed to be reduced, it was twice as big as you wanted it to be, I don't think you would dream of pruning it when it looked like that. It looks spectacular. You would wait a couple of weeks until it's done flowering, and then you would prune it to the size you want it. And if you did so, that would work very well for the plant, and you'd get a nice flower show next year. But if you wouldn't prune off the flowers, you should also consider where flowers come from. They come from flower buds. And then we must consider that spring flowering shrubs and trees like the forsythia, like lilacs, like flowering cherries, and so many more rhododendrons, they form their flower buds at the end of the previous year's growing season so that they're ready to go when it warms up. And therefore, if we prune off those flower buds in September, in January, or in March, we're doing the exact same thing to the flower show, not to the health of the plant, but to the flower show that's been done here. That plant on the left got pruned after the flower buds formed, and it didn't have any time to regrow new ones. So spring flowering buds, spring flowering plants should always be pruned sort of in the month, maybe up to 2 months after they flower, if you don't want to compromise the flower show. It should be noted that not all flowering plants bloom in the spring. Of course, there are some that bloom later in the season, and those typically bloom on not on the buds that were formed last year, but on buds that are formed this year. So I'm thinking of things like butterfly bush, one of my favorites, spireas, certain hydrangeas, but not all of them. You should always know what you have and why you're pruning it. But those plants bloom in July and August. They grow their stems, they form their flower buds, and they flower all in one growing season. So you can prune them at the end of the year. You can prune them in the early spring. They'll still grow. They're still flower. So just consider, if you want a flower show, think about when your flower buds are formed, because your pruning will affect it. I can dig into that question more if folks want to during the Q&A, but I'm going to hand it back, the baton back to Tim real quick so he can let you know how to stay in contact or in touch with our work and everything.
Thanks, John. Always fun to present with John because I feel like I learn more than I teach, which is wonderful. A couple of ways just to stay in contact with us. We are on social media, Smith College Botanic Garden. We're very active, and in fact, doing a lot of time talking and sharing what our students are up to behind the scenes. You can also stay up to date at garden.smith.edu, our website. And then I'd encourage you to sign up for our free e-newsletter Digitalis. We just put out our issue for that, which was a bulb show recap. And then if you're interested, you can join the Friends of the Botanic Garden as well. Our friends always hear what's happening very, very first. And finally, I wanted to say, I think we have a couple of participants in the audience who are members of our Alum Leadership Council. And so I wanted to say thank you to them for their continued guidance and support.
Great. Thank you so much, John and Tim. I learned so much when I listened to you. I also hear a lot of questions that we hear as Master Gardeners too when we're out and about. So and reach out to your local Master Gardeners too, because the organizations definitely do a lot of this work. So we have some great questions that were pre-submitted. We have some questions that were submitted as Tim and John were talking. And we'll address some of the ones that came in as part of the registration, and then we can touch on some of them that we haven't had an opportunity to answer while I think John was answering some while Tim was talking, and Tim was answering some while John was talking, and I threw in a couple too. So just great questions, and we know this is such a very popular topic for everyone. So we had some questions about sources for native plants. And of course, we know that native is different depending on what your growing zone is. But can you talk a little bit about some native sources, both in the sort of the Western Mass and New England area, and then others that you might know about in other areas?
Sure, I can take the first swing at that. More than anything else, I feel grateful to be close to Native Plant Trust and Garden in the Woods and the Sami nursery that they have there. They're doing fantastic work and sort of leading the charge, not just on natives, but on sustainably and sustainably sourced and ecologically valuable natives. Not all natives, well, let me clarify what I mean by that. Native plants like lobelia, cardinal flower, a wonderful wetland plant that we have around here, probably the nicest red in the botanical world. Having one that is collected responsibly from seed in the wild helps sustain the genetic diversity that Magnolia project I was talking about in my talk is aimed at doing for Magnolia species. And Native Plant Trust is one of the few that's doing that. A lot of nurseries grow things that are cultivars, and they are clonal or close to being clonal. They're very shallow genetically, and they often don't have the same value to pollinators. And if they're overused, they're sort of putting pollen, they're sort of overrepresenting the pollen of one single plant, because sometimes these popular plants get reproduced by the millions and are overrepresented in our landscape. So Native Plant Trust is one that's great. There's I think Eco 59 is another one that you can get seeds from that are harvested the same way. If you're a little further down south, connecting with Mount Cuba Center down there is a botanic garden that is really focused exclusively on promoting the use of native plants and building ecologically resilient landscapes. And they're a great one to connect with. But if you're in the central New England area, the Sami nursery is a great place to get it. But I think that the message about planting native plants is really starting to gain some inertia, and nurseries are responding. Mm-hmm. So you can find them anywhere.
And Tim, do you have anything to add?
Maybe I would just add that we really love working with local nurseries, locally owned nurseries. Not only does that mean that, you know, we are supporting the people that live in our community, it also means that we get the chance to really build relationships with people who this is their life. They are wonderful resources, wonderful assets. Oftentimes they're monitoring the same things we're monitoring. They're worried about invasives, they're worried about climate change, and they can really help us. They can help us be successful by preventing us from making mistakes in the first place if we build a relationship with them.
Mm-hmm. I would also add that local nurseries are very aware of pollinator-friendly plants for your specific region too. So I think that's certainly important to bear in mind. So some of the other questions we had were about sort of emerging weeds and poison ivy and bindweed and that sort of thing, and identifying those. And I know, we can often go to the internet. You have good sources, and responsibly go to the internet, good sources for figuring out what those things are.
I can start on that because that's a battle we fight on our landscape here for sure. And I think the thing that's missing often from those internet resources is that expect it to be a sustained battle. Mm-hmm. It's not going to be go in with the right chemical or the right timing of pulling this, or if you just get them before they flower, that's going to just magically make something like bindweed or poison ivy go away. You often have to put a really sustained effort. You have to beat it back and then be willing to be vigilant the second it's coming out, treat it with whatever method, whether that's manual pulling. Sometimes you can find people, we're lucky we have my colleague Ben is immune to poison ivy, and that serves us well from time to time. He's also very careful not to get it on the tools too, which the rest of us are so grateful for. But I've heard things like goats can get poison ivy out of your, if you have some like woodland area that you just want to get it out of. There's people that in the valley here that rent out goats, set up a temporary. So there's a lot of methods, but whether it's, regardless of what it is, expect a sustained effort. Expect regular vigilance, going out once a week and getting things the second they emerge. Sometimes if they're annual plants, you can have really good success by not letting them flower. Neither of the two you mentioned are annuals, but some weeds are annuals, and considering that is important when you treat them. You don't want to, if it's an annual and you're going to use a chemical control, don't go out and spray it after they've already gone to seed. Just wait until they're gone. There's a Verna Drabas one you see out there now that's a little annual. It'll be gone very soon. And so that's just my advice, is it's going to take a sustained effort regardless of the method you use. A lot of them are such a pain. The bindweed, you never get the roots. You can pull it and it just laughs at you. Mm-hmm. You just make it
Japanese
mad.
knotweed.
Yes, yeah, exactly. It just is that all you've got, and it's back. Yeah, Japanese knotweed one in particular. I do find that timing actually does. It is worth on some of them considering timing. We've had good luck. We tried to minimize chemical inputs, but where we've had to use them, with Japanese knotweed, cutting it back and then letting a little bit of regrowth happen, and treating that with a broad spectrum herbicide works much better than spraying an adult plant. A large plant.
Good. Okay. Anything you want to add, Tim, or you want to go to the next question?
John's got it. I mean, it's a lot of trial and error. If you are able to, sometimes you can modify the environment enough that it becomes less tolerant, like the invasives do less well, but especially things that are shade tolerant, that's really, really hard, because you often don't want to, cut down trees in order to fight something that's growing on the ground. Vigilance, John has it.
Right, exactly. And awareness too. When I was doing the Master Gardener program, we were required to read, going into the program, Bringing Nature Home by Doug Ptolemy. And it's a really astounding book about learning about invasive species and just be aware of them. I think Asian bittersweet has just become so ubiquitous, and we see it everywhere. And that's one that is a sustained battle for sure. You just have to stay on top of it. Let's see, what else do we have? So any advice for pots or raised beds, things to do to help them be successful, whether it's raised beds for vegetables or vegetables and herbs that survive well in pots, perhaps on a city dwelling patio. We had a question in the Q&A about trees for pots that can survive, on a patio in the city. Thoughts about that?
I'll go first. I really like raised beds. I have arthritic knees and I like a little bit of elevation. I'm also in a city lot that has very, very sandy soil. And so I just, like I said in my presentation, a couple of 2x6s stacked on each other made into a square or rectangle. Cedar works well because it doesn't break down as fast. I would not use treated lumber at all. You can use pine, but you might only get 2 or 3 growing seasons out of it. But I find that a very comfortable way to garden. It also introduces a level of structure and organization to the garden. Yeah, as far as, pots and pot types, I might just say, like, maybe this sounds a little bit like a question from somebody who might just be getting into gardening. And I would just want to start by being very encouraging that every plant you accidentally kill is just a hallmark of future growth. I think all gardeners know there's these plants that you just, for some reason, everyone else can grow them and you just can't. We just got to keep trying. Maybe I don't like terracotta. I don't like clay pots because I don't like to water that much. But for people that are over waters, terracotta works really, really well. So I like plastic, but plastic isn't the most sustainable. But I can also recycle the plastic pots that I get from my local nursery. So I think it's a lot of trial and error and just enjoying that. Maybe gardeners don't talk about that enough, that we're often, that our mistakes are our greatest learning opportunities. And eventually you just kind of learn to roll with that. John?
I guess 2 things I'll just add to that. One is, well, to continue on Tim's thought, we were talking sort of the start of this before we went live. I feel a little uncomfortable sometimes presenting myself as the expert on anything, because one lifetime isn't enough to learn. You can dig into a couple things and learn a couple things, and the best thing is to hang out with somebody who's done a couple other things, and collectively as a community you can probably find great horticulture solutions. But yeah, I make a ton of errors. I have, and I still do. On the question though, one thing I want to add is that, especially when we're thinking about balcony pots or maybe in urban conditions, be realistic about the growing environment you have. You might hear something like herbs are great for pots. That's true, but shade isn't. And if your balcony is on the north side of the building, just be realistic about the growing conditions you have, and select your plant material based on what's going to do well there.
Mm-hmm. Right, and size too. The question about the tree being in a pot on a balcony, that trees can get really big. So you want to be thinking about what variety you choose for that. And it really harkens back to your thoughts about the roots, and being sure that the roots have enough space to do their job in sustaining the tree. Yeah, good.
It can be a lot of work to keep a tree sort of, bonsai trees can live 300 years, so you can definitely do it, but it's a lot of work. And if you enjoy the work, it's a great thing to get into. But if you're imagining just putting a tree in a pot and watering it and there you go, it's going to be a bit more than that.
Right. Thanks. So we've had a couple questions about jumping worms, which are a seemingly new thing, and yet they're not. Are you struggling with them on campus anywhere? Do you have any tips for how to deal with them in home gardens?
It just came up yesterday, actually. We were looking to bring some wood chips out to the McLeish Field Station, again, where that magnolia collection is ultimately going to be held. And Paul Wetzel, our partner that I was talking to, said that he had noted that there were some jumping worms in the wood chip pile at Fort Hill, which is, I wouldn't expect to find any worms, period, there. But just to let people know, if they don't know what we're talking about, most earthworms that we have around here, although they're gardeners' friends, are sort of ecologically disruptive. They affect the soil nutrient cycle in an unnatural way. Specifically, they accelerate it. So most of the worms we've had for the last couple hundred years are native to Asia, maybe, or sorry, Europe, Eurasia, and more recently, a smaller species, but much faster reproducing is these Asiatic jumping worms. They're called jumping worms because this is part of how you can identify them. If you perturb them in any way, they go into a wriggling fit and sometimes even pop off the ground. But they are potentially ecologically disruptive because they're going to consume that organic forest floor layer as they make their way into our natural areas much faster than the plants that have adapted to that space want them to. So we don't know what the outcomes will be, but there's a lot of concern around that. They do nibble on live roots too, to some extent, and that could be problematic. So we're trying not to spread them around. Learning how to identify them is important. There's not great advice on how to stop the spread other than not moving soil around. So when you're swapping plants, that's something to think about, making sure you don't have worms in there. Although if you do it during the growing season, they overwinter as little like poppy seed size cocoons. So how do you find those? It's a little unnerving. There are some biological controls that they're working on. I think they've discovered that if you put have more abrasive soils, like incorporating biochar, and I don't know if sand was one of them, but certain soils are less friendly to Asiatic jumping worms. But I would say stay tuned to your extension services are doing most of the messaging right now, and you can connect with your local extension service to learn more about that and to stay update on what control methods look like. But right now it's just sort of people biting their fingernails, hoping that it isn't as bad as it might be. So,
Right. Anything you want to add, Tim? No.
Stay tuned. Yeah, keep watching.
Yeah, exactly. It is a relatively new thing. I think they've been around, but we're just very aware of them now in the gardening world. And I think especially plant swaps are very popular. And I know that many have been canceled this summer in particular because of the concern about jumping worms. So while we're on the topic of pests and insects, and there are good insects and not so good insects, any suggestions for eliminating, discouraging ticks in your landscape? And that's something we're all dealing with right outside our door, it seems like. What do you all do on campus?
I have never found a tick on myself in 25 years at Smith. So part of that is that it's a very, despite our gardens are sort of buffered and not too friendly to the local, or haven't been as friendly to the local ecology as we would actually like them to be. Mm-hmm. But we can manage our exposure to ticks by, being aware of how you get them. It is certainly having stuff brush up against your legs is one likely way, but having these buffers where, think about the vectors of ticks. It's the mice and things of that nature that are bringing them in. Just when you step out of an area where you might have gotten a tick, just checking your legs, wearing the right color clothing when you're gardening. The white light colored stuff allows the ticks to be more visible. And the question about reducing them, I'm not a fan of using chemical controls, and I don't like if you get rid of your ticks and then a mouse comes on your property the next day. I don't see how that really does anything. It's something we're going to have to live with, and I'm not sure what living with the threat of ticks looks like, but I realized that was sort of a zigzaggy answer that didn't really come to a nice conclusion. But there isn't an easy just do this, and there's bombing your place with chemicals, but I'm not sure that that's a healthier solution. I think the way our students and our staff use the campus, the risk of tick threats is extremely low at the moment.
From a home gardener perspective, I have more problems with this at home than we do on campus. Our house abuts some natural land, and tick pressure is immense. So last year we actually put in a mulch barrier. So the idea there is that they don't like to travel over open ground, and it can be a little bit hotter. And so we tried that. I would say, John is right. We work as hard as we can to avoid chemicals, and sometimes chemical barriers might be it might be the only option to try and, especially if we're not talking about applying them over an entire forest, but trying to establish a barrier that can be a very economical sort of low, a fairly low impact chemical intervention. And then the other thing is, of course, all the things that are within our control. If you're in tick areas, tuck your socks pull your socks over your pants, tuck your shirt in, regular tick checks, and right, we're right near the epicenter of Lyme disease. So we just have to be really vigilant and aware of that.
Indeed.
It's getting easier to find permethrin treated clothing too, which, on one hand might feel a little uncomfortable wearing clothing that's been treated with a chemical on the outside of it, but at the same time, the dose is so incredibly low and it's aimed at the outside where the tick would be exposed. Ticks are so sensitive to it. And if you're in a situation where the risk of ticks and tick-borne illness is really high, you might want to consider that risk reward of using permethrin treated clothing. You could do an internet search to find it. You can send in your own clothes to have it treated if you want to.
Yeah, I have a pair of boots, tall boots that I wear in the garden. That's what I do my gardening with. And about once a week, I just spray them with permethrin just to have that barrier at least at the ground, and then doing the tick checks as well, constantly. Yeah. So another question about any advice for controlling white flies, particularly on tomato plants. Tim, have you had?
I saw that. I think that this might be a regional issue. I'm guessing maybe a more southerly garden. This isn't really or a greenhouse grower, perhaps. It's not something that I've encountered. What I would look at is spacing. Make sure there's good airflow. I would look at trellising and or pruning to really make sure there's very, very good airflow. I might start to look at varietal selection to find something that's a little bit more resilient. Some tomatoes, especially the hairier stemmed tomatoes, tend to be less prone to insect pressure. And then as a last step, there's some organic insecticidal soaps vigilantly applied, I believe, would work on white flies, but that's more of a greenhouse pest. So I'd have to learn more about the problem.
Right. Well, we are just about at time, and I know you have a hard stop at 2 p.m., Tim, so I want to be respectful of that time. We so appreciate your time for this popular topic. We could have a whole series for sure on gardening, but we thank you very much, and thank you all for tuning in. We had a great number of participants, and stay tuned for more webinars planned for the coming year. So thanks again. Thank you, John. Thank you, Tim. And keep an eye on the Botanic Garden for upcoming programs. Great. I'll sign off. Thank you.